Story number 1. Whispers in the Silent Land. I never expected to find myself lost in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Growing up, I'd always heard about the majestic pine forests, the rugged terrain, the mysteries tucked away in every cave and crevice. Sure, Mount Rushmore got all the headlines, but something about the legends of the Lakota people, especially the old stories about a forbidden region they called Vung Dat Kam Lang, or the Silent Land, had wormed its way into my imagination. They said it was an ancient place, older than any human memory, haunted by spirits that wouldn't rest. It sounded like the perfect mystery for a curious fool like me. My name is James Halstead, a freelance writer and sometimes podcaster. Ghost stories, cryptids, local legends, those are my bread and butter. I've chased the Mothman in West Virginia, interviewed residents near the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, and even spent a night searching for the Jersey Devil. The more outlandish the tale, the more it tugged at me. The Black Hills had always been on my list, thanks to a half-remembered story about an expedition that vanished decades ago. Nobody found them, just some cryptic journals scrawled with strange symbols and a single warning, Chung Theo Doi Tu Trong Bong Toi. In English, it translates to something like, they watch from the darkness. I told myself I'd track down that story one day, really dig in and see if it was all an urban legend or if there was something real to it. When I got a tip from a local contact named Becca, who'd done volunteer ranger work in the area, I jumped at the chance. She said she knew the location of that silent land, and even heard rumors of a hidden canyon where the forest felt wrong, where even the wildlife stayed away. That was all I needed to hear. I drove into South Dakota on a crisp autumn afternoon. The Black Hills loomed in the distance, dark silhouettes rising against the pastel sky. The closer I got, the more the pines dominated the horizon. There was a kind of stillness to those woods, peaceful on the surface, but strangely foreboding if you caught the vibe just right. I felt it in my bones, a faint prickle of anxiety that almost had me turning around. But I'd come this far, so I pressed on. Becca had arranged for me to stay in a small cabin near Rapid Creek, a spot popular with fishermen. When I arrived, she greeted me on the porch, wearing worn jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair tied back. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s, but her eyes shone with the confidence of someone who'd spent plenty of time in the wild. She gave me a quick grin and motioned me inside. "You made it," she said, matter of fact. "I was starting to worry you'd bail." I shrugged, hefting my duffel bag. "Not yet. Think you can show me around tomorrow?" She nodded. "Sure. But we're going to keep it quiet. The area we're heading to is, well, let's just say the Lakota have strong feelings about it. They'll tell you it's off limits, full of old spirits. The rangers mostly pretend it doesn't exist. It's safer that way. Fewer people going missing." Becca's casual mention of people going missing made my stomach twinge. Still, I'd come here for a scare, and that's exactly what I was getting. After dinner, canned chili and cornbread, I tried to push away the lingering nerves and get some sleep. But I couldn't. I lay awake, listening to the wind rustle through the pines. The old stories bounced around in my head, an expedition lost, cryptic notes, watchers in the dark. At some point, I must have drifted off, because my dreams were full of towering trees, blanketed in shadow, and the sound of whispering voices just out of sight. We set out the next morning, our packs heavy with supplies. Becca led the way, navigating old logging roads that snaked through the dense forest. After a few miles, the road dwindled into a footpath, then dissolved into nothing but pine needles and rocky ground. I followed her in silence, marveling at how easily she moved, as if she belonged to these woods. I'd been hiking plenty, but the terrain here was unforgiving, steep slopes, hidden ravines, dense undergrowth. Around midday, we reached a narrow ravine where the trees grew taller, closer together, their branches knitting overhead to block out most of the sky. The temperature dropped noticeably. Even the birds seemed to avoid the canopy. My breath caught when I saw old carvings on a few trunks, faint symbols that looked vaguely geometric. Becca paused, touching one carving lightly. "These have been here for decades," she said softly. "Nobody seems to know who made them. Some think it was the expedition that disappeared, marking the way. Others say it's older than that." I snapped a few photos, feeling a chill at the back of my neck. The wind sighed through the branches, sounding almost like a whisper. Chum Theo doi tu trong bong toi. The words from that old note crept back into my mind. I shivered, brushing off the eerie sensation. We continued deeper, and as the afternoon wore on, we stumbled across something unexpected, a broken-down camper trailer, half buried in leaves. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, rust eaten through the frame, windows shattered. No sign of a person. Becca eyed it warily. No idea who left this here, she said. I've never seen it before. I moved closer, peering inside. A rotten sleeping bag lay on the floor, along with a backpack that might have once been red but was now a filthy maroon. I crouched, rummaging carefully. Inside the bag, I found some moldy clothes, an ancient flashlight, and a journal. My heart quickened. The cover was warped, pages stuck together. I eased it open, only to see water-stained writing, nearly illegible. I managed to decipher a few lines. Night 4, something in the woods outside, scratching at the metal. I hear it moving around. Lisa is scared. I told her we should leave, but the truck won't start. Night 5, the whispers are getting louder. They come from nowhere and everywhere. I see shapes between the trees. It's real. God help us, it's real. A cold lump formed in my gut. I flipped a few more pages, but the rest was too damaged to read, except for a single scrawled line near the end, "Never leave the light." They are waiting. I glanced at Becca. Looks like they never made it out. She pressed her lips together. Yeah. Let's keep moving. So we did, with a new sense of unease. The forest felt heavier after that discovery, as though the trees themselves were aware of our presence and closing ranks. An odd hush fell around us. Even Becca, usually chatty, went quiet. Just before dusk, we arrived at what Becca called the Forbidden Canyon. Not an official name, but locals whispered about it. The opening was marked by two tall rock formations, like crude pillars. Between them, the ground sloped downward into a gully choked with ferns and brambles. The air was thick, moist, with a faint decay smell. My skin prickled. We'll make camp up here, Becca said, indicating a flat shelf of rock near the canyon's entrance. I don't want to go down there at night. We pitched a small tent, built a fire, and tried to keep our spirits high. Becca told me stories about local wildlife, mountain lions, bobcats, even rumored wolves. But I caught the tremor in her voice. She was scared, too, though she tried to hide it. As night fell, the darkness was absolute. The moon barely penetrated the dense canopy. I stayed close to the fire, remembering the words from the battered journal, "Never leave the light." Becca followed suit. For hours, we talked in low voices, jumping at every rustle in the undergrowth. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, it was just a faint shuffling, like an animal sniffing around. But then came a soft, almost human sound, like a whisper without breath. I froze, eyes on Becca. She held a finger to her lips, brow furrowed. The whisper drifted through the trees, impossible to pinpoint. My heart hammered. Another faint sound followed, a click or tap, like wood on wood. Then silence. The hairs on my arms stood up. I strained my ears. Nothing. After a tense minute, Becca exhaled slowly, shaking her head. Probably just the wind, she muttered. Neither of us believed that. Sleep was impossible. Sometime after 2 a.m., Becca dozed off in the tent, leaving me alone by the dying embers of the fire. I'd added more wood earlier, but it was burning too fast. My flashlight was at my side, extra batteries in my pocket. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd need them. I stared into the dark forest. The night was so quiet, I could hear my own pulse. Then came that whisper again, closer now, so soft I almost missed it. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, too faint to catch words. My spine tingled. I inched closer to the fire, the journal's warning echoing in my head. Suddenly, a shape flickered between two trees, vague, shadowy, gone in an instant. My throat closed up. I fumbled for my flashlight and aimed it, but found nothing except branches swaying. Another movement to my left. I whirled, heart in my throat. Still nothing. But the whispers, they were multiplying, swirling around me like a breeze that carried speech instead of air. I scrambled to the tent. "Becca," I hissed. "Something's out here." She jerked awake, grabbing her own flashlight. We stepped outside together. The fire was down to embers, casting faint red light across our campsite. She kicked in more wood, stirring up sparks. Then we heard it, clear as day, a low moan that resonated through the canyon. It was neither animal nor human. A primal, haunting sound. Becca's face went pale. We should leave," she whispered. "We can't do this at night, though. We'll get lost." We agreed to wait for dawn. But neither of us slept. We huddled by the fire, flashlights ready, my hand on the camp knife. The moan came again, distant, but it set my teeth on edge. And the whispering never really stopped, like 1,000 tiny voices luring us into the darkness. Morning took forever. The first sliver of sunrise brought a wave of relief, though the forest canopy still trapped gloom. We packed up camp in record time, deciding to push into the canyon just long enough to get some photos and see if we could find any trace of the lost expedition or others who vanished. The canyon floor was damp, the moss underfoot slick. Mist clung to the ferns like spiderwebs. We moved slowly, scanning for signs of human activity, footprints, campsites, anything. The place felt like a dead zone. No birds, no insects buzzing, just an eerie hush broken by our footsteps. An hour in, we found an old campsite. Tent poles rusted, tarp shredded. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, pots and pans scattered, personal items half buried in dirt. More strange carvings marked nearby trees, some of them eerily similar to the ones we'd seen at the ravine, but others looked more elaborate, almost runic. And I noticed something that made my blood run cold, tiny handprints etched into the bark, far too small and delicate to belong to an adult. "Did children come out here?" I whispered. Becca shook her head, unnerved. Nobody local would bring kids into the silent land. We documented what we could, then pressed deeper. Eventually, the canyon walls rose steeply, narrowing into a shadowy gorge. The light was dim, barely enough to see. The whispers returned, faint but steady, pricking at my consciousness like static on an old radio. Goosebumps rippled across my skin. Then we came upon it, a rocky overhang where someone had painted strange symbols in red. The paint looked ancient, flaking off, yet the shapes were still visible, spirals, jagged lines intersecting. At the center was a crude figure, half human, half animal, arms outstretched. My heart pounded. Becca stared at it, her voice trembling. "This is Lakota territory, but these symbols, I've never seen them in their traditional art. This is something else." I touched one spiral, an impulsive, stupid move. A flash of dizziness hit me, my vision blurring. For a split second, it felt like I saw the canyon differently, trees twisted, the ground pulsing, silhouettes lurking among the trunks. And the whispers grew deafening. I yanked my hand away, stumbling back. Becca caught my arm. "You okay?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, just dizzy. Let's keep going." Not far from the painted overhang, we found a scattering of old books and papers strewn across the ground like someone had tossed them in panic. Most were too decayed to handle, but a few pages were partially intact. I carefully picked one up, a water-stained page full of pencil sketches, faces with hollow eyes, shadowy figures, spirals matching the paintings. My heart rate spiked when I saw words scribbled in shaky letters. "No escape, nights are endless, shadows walking, can't sleep, they watch from the darkness." This had to be from that missing expedition, or someone else who met the same fate. Becca took a photo with her phone, hands trembling. We flipped another page, revealing a crudely drawn map of the canyon, with an X near the top. An arrow pointed to it with the word gate, scrawled beside it. "Gate to what?" Becca asked, voice hushed. I had no answer, but dread coiled in my stomach. The moaning wind returned, swirling leaves at our feet. We looked at each other, silent agreement passing between us. We had to see what was marked at that X, if only to confirm this place's secrets. Following the sketchy map led us deeper into the narrow gorge. The day wore on, but it felt like the sun refused to rise any higher, leaving us trapped in perpetual twilight. The air grew heavier, the whispers more pronounced. I started catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes ducking behind boulders, slipping between trees. Every time I turned to look, they vanished. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Becca grabbed my arm at one point. "Look," she hissed, pointing to a mossy slope. I squinted, seeing a slender figure crouched there, entirely black against the greenery. It had no distinct features, just a tall, thin outline. Then it melted backward into the shadows. She and I locked eyes, adrenaline roaring in our veins. We were definitely not alone. We picked up the pace, anxiety fueling us. At last, we found a hidden clearing where a massive stone stood upright, almost like a monolith. The spiral symbols covered it, etched deep. The clearing reeked of decay. On the ground, a half-buried crate spilled old supplies, rusty tools, a moldy tent. My stomach lurched when I saw a human femur lying next to it. The bone was snapped in half, edges stained dark. A strangled sound escaped Becca's throat. I forced myself to remain calm. This must be the place. The gate. She nodded shakily. We should document it and leave. Now. I agreed. But as we took photos, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died, replaced by a suffocating hush. My ears popped, like a pressure drop before a storm. The whispering escalated, forming a chorus of disembodied voices. Becca gripped my hand. We backed away from the stone, stepping carefully over the broken crate and scattered bones. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw one of those shadow figures step into the clearing. It stood on two legs, unnaturally tall, arms elongated. Another emerged from behind the monolith, then another from the tree line. They had no faces, no features, just voids and humanoid shape. My mind screamed to run, but fear rooted me to the spot. Becca tugged my sleeve. I forced my legs to move. We fled, hearts thundering. The silhouettes gave chase, gliding effortlessly across the uneven ground. I risked a glance back. Their limbs bent in impossible angles, each step silent, as if they barely touched the earth. The whispered voices grew louder, feeding on our terror. We tore through the trees, branches whipping our faces. My lungs burned, my throat raw from panting. Occasionally, I glimpsed the shapes flitting between trunks, always just out of reach, herding us deeper into the forest rather than letting us escape. The sense of direction vanished. The canyon twisted around us, each path leading somewhere unfamiliar. At some point, we stumbled onto a clearing with a huge, gnarled oak in the center. Old Lakota markings decorated its trunk. The whispering reached a fever pitch, circling us, pressing in like invisible hands. Becca cried out, shining her flashlight in wild arcs, but it only revealed more shadows dancing at the edges of the beam. A shape lunged, spindly arms stretching. We dove aside. I felt a cold, electric jolt across my shoulder, as if the air itself had bit me. Pain flared, but I forced myself up, dragging Becca with me. The shadows melted back into darkness, then reformed, mocking us. "This way," she yelled, pointing to a slope that might lead out of the canyon. We scrambled upward, skin scraping on sharp rocks. The intangible voices echoed in my skull, too many to count, each murmuring in an ancient, forgotten tongue. Or was it Lakota? Or something older still? The climb felt endless. Night closed in again, or maybe the forest canopy just swallowed the daylight. My flashlight flickered. Panic seized me. Never leave the light. We pressed on. I could barely see Becca's form ahead of me. The whispering crescendoed, 1,000 hissing voices. The shadows swarmed. My flashlight died abruptly, plunging us into suffocating blackness. Becca screamed. Something yanked at my pack. I lashed out with my camp knife, hitting nothing. Then a wave of cold pressure hit me, disorienting my senses. I fell, tumbling down the slope. My head struck a root, pain blooming like fireworks. The world spun. I woke to pale dawn light filtering through the trees. My head throbbed, dried blood crusting my temple. I was alone. My voice came out in a croak. Becca? Silence. My panic flared. I scrambled up, ignoring the dizziness, calling her name. No reply. The forest around me seemed deserted, the hush almost mocking. Where had the shadows gone? I staggered in a random direction, searching for any sign of my companion. After what felt like hours, I found footprints, 2 sets, one heavier, one smaller, leading deeper into the forest. My heart lifted. She might still be alive, or at least I could find her. I followed them with single-minded desperation, weaving through twisted pines and rocky outcrops. But as I progressed, I saw things. Scraps of clothing snagged on branches that looked like hers. Smears of something dark on the moss. Splinters of her flashlight. The footprints became erratic, zigzagging as if she was being chased or dragged. My stomach twisted at the possibilities. I stumbled onto a rocky ledge overlooking a ravine. Her footprints ended abruptly at the edge, as though she stepped off into thin air. Peering down, I saw only dense foliage. My heart sank, despair flooding me. Had she fallen? Or worse, been taken? I clung to the hope she might have escaped another way. Tears blurred my vision. A faint sound drifted on the breeze, almost like my name. James. James. I turned, scanning the forest. No one. Then came a whisper, too soft to catch. Were the shadows toying with me, mimicking her voice? Desperation fueled me now. I had to get out of this cursed canyon. I'd search for help, rangers, anyone who could form a search party. The forest felt hostile, but the sun was rising, giving me enough light to move quickly. I forced myself to stay calm, following the slope upward until the terrain began to resemble where we first camped. Midday, I recognized a fallen pine that we'd passed the prior morning. Relief soared, I was on the right track. The sense of being watched never left me, but the shadows no longer materialized. Maybe they preferred the depths of the canyon, or maybe they'd had their fill of terrorizing me. At last, I found the campsite where we'd spent that doomed night. The ashes of our fire were cold. My car was miles away, but if I followed the ridge, I could reach the old logging road by nightfall. With luck, I'd drive to the nearest station and beg for a rescue operation. I spared one last glance at the canyon below. The trees swayed, concealing the secrets of the silent land. A wave of guilt choked me. Becca was still out there, or so I prayed. But if I stayed, I'd end up like the vanished expedition, nothing left but cryptic journals. My only chance of helping her was to get more people, better equipment. Maybe an entire search party. Wincing at the throbbing in my head, I set off. I emerged from the Black Hills that evening, exhausted and half delirious. The first ranger I found looked at me like I was insane, but eventually they assembled a small team to check the canyon. It took days, searching, scouring, finding traces of camp gear, footprints, and those disturbing carvings. But no definitive sign of Becca. They discovered a few bone fragments, possibly human, scattered near that monolith clearing. DNA tests were inconclusive, thanks to decomposition and animal interference. Ultimately, the official report listed Becca as missing, presumed dead. Word spread about my story, the shadows, the whispers, the ancient symbols. Most folks dismissed me as traumatized, hallucinating from fear and injury. But I know what I saw. The Forbidden Canyon, that monolith, the watchers in the darkness, they're real. The Lakota warnings were right, the silent land is no place for us. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Months have passed, and I still can't sleep through the night. I dream of tall, faceless silhouettes drifting through the pines, of a whispered chorus calling my name. Sometimes, I see Becca among them, eyes vacant, her voice echoing in that same chilling murmur. I wake up drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding. I've tried telling my story to whoever will listen. A few paranormal enthusiasts believe me. Most do not. But I'm writing this down for anyone who might wander into the Black Hills, chasing old legends or looking for hidden beauty. If you hear about a place called the Silent Land, if you see those spiral carvings or find old notes about watchers in the dark, turn around. Leave. Because once you step foot in that canyon, you invite the whispers to follow you. And believe me, they'll never stop. So heed this warning, there are corners of this earth that belong to older, darker presences. They don't want us there, or perhaps they crave our fear. Either way, they watch, always from the shadows. If you awaken them, if you set foot in their domain, you risk becoming just another voice in the wind, another story told around the campfire, only you won't be there to hear it. I'm still searching for closure, for answers about Becca, for a reason why the shadows didn't take me. But the nightmares tell me I'm living on borrowed time. The next time I step into the Black Hills, they may finish what they started. If you value your life and your soul, stay away from the silent land. Because in that forbidden canyon, they are watching from the darkness. And once they've seen you, there's no going back. Story number 2. Crypt of the Damned. My name is Nathaniel Brooks, and for most of my life, I chased the ghosts of history. Whether sifting through dusty Civil War letters or peeling back the layers of abandoned homes, I found comfort in the quiet presence of the past. Savannah, Georgia, always called to me. I'd visited on weekend trips, strolling beneath the Spanish moss that drapes its old oaks, reading every plaque on every statue, trying to feel the stories that seep through the cobblestones. There's an undeniable weight to the air in Savannah, something heavy, haunted, and strangely inviting. I never imagined that the city's shadows would follow me home, or that the quiet spirits of Savannah's old cemeteries might turn dark and hungry. But that's exactly what happened when I joined an archaeological team working beneath Colonial Park Cemetery, unearthing secrets that should have stayed buried. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress or superstition. But there are nights now, long, brutal nights, when I hear the rattling knock on my bedroom door and feel a chill creeping up my spine, and I know the truth. I'm writing this in a desperate attempt to warn anyone who might be pulled in by curiosity or ambition. Certain doors, once opened, can't be closed again. Certain nightmares follow you, no matter how fast you run. It started innocently enough, a phone call from my old mentor, Dr. April McAllister, a renowned historian and archaeologist who just secured grants to excavate a sealed tunnel system discovered beneath Colonial Park Cemetery. She'd heard rumors, whispers, really, of lost crypts dating back to the 18th century. Most experts dismissed it as rumor or local lore. But when a sinkhole exposed part of an underground passage, she leapt on the chance. "Nat," she said with breathless excitement, "this is once in a lifetime. We've already found coffins, bone fragments, even old mortar inscriptions. But we think there's more. A sublevel, maybe. You want in?" My heart pounded. Working with April again, in Savannah no less, was a dream. "Count me in," I replied, ignoring the pang of unease that flickered through me. If I'm honest, that pang was excitement. A week later, I arrived at the small field station set up behind the caretaker's shed. The team wasn't large, 8 of us in total, plus a few rotating grad students from the local university. April greeted me with a hug, her eyes shining behind her thick glasses. She led me through the winding rows of gravestones, all coated in a patina of time, to a corner where the chain-link fence parted. We ducked beneath caution tape, stepping into a rectangular pit about 8 feet deep. At one edge, a ragged hole in the brick foundation beckoned, a dark passage. April explained that the city had no record of catacombs or crypts beneath Colonial Park Cemetery, though diaries from the 1700s hinted at secret burials. Possibly plague victims, possibly criminals, maybe even the remains of duels that ended too violently. I felt a little shiver then, as if Savannah's restless dead were paying attention. April insisted we gear up properly, helmets with lamps, gloves, face masks in case of mold or fungal spores. Inside the tunnel, the air felt cool and stale, thick with centuries of decay. Our flashlights caught glimpses of crumbling masonry and old timbers used to support the ceiling. Occasionally, we saw faint scribbles, graffiti, perhaps, or runic scrawl left by bored gravediggers. Progress was slow, with the team meticulously brushing away dirt and debris, snapping photos, documenting every artifact. On my first full day, I mostly cataloged scraps of wood that might have been coffin fragments. Uneventful, if a bit claustrophobic. But come late afternoon, things changed. We stumbled onto a sealed doorway. Not just a boarded passage, this was a solid stone archway, bricked up and plastered over with a layer of ancient mortar. April's eyes lit up. We found references to a smaller crypt beyond the main catacombs, she whispered. This could be it. It took the rest of the day to remove the mortar safely without destroying the structure. The bricks behind it were damp, some crumbling at a touch. At last, we pried one loose, then another, until a narrow opening gaped into pitch blackness. A sour smell wafted out, something between damp earth and rotten eggs. The team exchanged uneasy glances. I'll go first, April said, voice trembling with excitement. Nat, you follow. We squeezed through the gap. My flashlight beam pierced swirling dust motes, revealing a cramped corridor leading down a short flight of stone steps. Each step was slick with algae or mold. At the bottom, the corridor opened into a small chamber. Our collective breaths caught at the sight. Ritual markings on the walls, strange geometric designs, swirls, and crosses we didn't recognize. Some looked reminiscent of West African glyphs or Haitian voodoo-veuves, but done in a distinctly 18th century colonial style. A row of skeletons in tattered remains of clothing, each skeleton pinned to the wall with iron shackles. My flashlight revealed twisted poses, as if they'd died struggling. The empty sockets of their skulls seemed to glare at us. A crude stone altar in the center, stained with dark blotches. Upon it lay a rusted dagger, a shallow bowl, and a scattering of melted wax lumps. A hush fell, broken only by the whir of the camera as one of the grad students took frantic photos. April whispered, "My God. This is bigger than we imagined." I approached the nearest skeleton, unsettled by the way the shackles pressed into the ribs. Strands of old rope still clung to the bones, as if they'd been bound extra tight. Something about the markings on the wall behind it, a series of interlocking circles and lines, made my stomach clench. They felt wrong, like they didn't belong to any known tradition. "Let's document everything," April said firmly, though her voice shook. "But carefully. This might be evidence of an unrecorded cult or secret society." The atmosphere in that crypt was oppressive, as if the centuries of suffering had soaked into the stone. We gathered samples, took pictures, jotted notes, yet none of us spoke above a whisper. After a couple hours, we retreated back to the main tunnel, sealing the opening as best we could with caution tape. A sense of relief swept over me once we left the crypt's stale air behind. That night, we regrouped at the field station to review our discoveries. Two of the grad students, Marie and Kevin, were unnerved, insisting they'd heard faint whispers in the crypt. I overheard them talking about how the shapes of certain symbols seemed to move at the edge of their vision. April dismissed it as an overactive imagination. I tried to sleep in the makeshift bunk area we'd set up in a rented building nearby. But Savannah's humid night pressed in, and my mind couldn't shake the image of those shackled skeletons. Around 2 a.m., I heard a distinct tapping on my window, a soft, deliberate knock. My heart leapt into my throat. I mustered the courage to peer outside, expecting to see a teammate or maybe a stray cat. But the street was empty. Not a soul in sight. A faint mist curled along the sidewalk. My nerves crackled. I convinced myself it was the wind or a branch tapping the glass. I lay back down, heart racing. The next morning, Dr. Emery, a quiet but brilliant archaeologist in our group, showed up bleary-eyed. He'd had nightmares, he said. Horrible dreams of dark corridors lined with chanting figures, beckoning him deeper. He laughed it off, but I caught the tremor in his voice. At the site, we continued the excavation, carefully analyzing the crypt's contents. 2 more skeletons lay in a smaller alcove, also shackled. We uncovered bits of parchment stuffed into a niche, fragments of writing in archaic French, referencing a cursed rite and blood of the bound. April was ecstatic, marveling at the chance to rewrite some corner of colonial history. But the deeper we delved, the heavier the atmosphere grew. It felt as though the tomb watched us. On the 4th day, while I was brushing debris off a carved sigil near the altar, a chunk of plaster broke away, revealing another symbol hidden beneath. This one was more elaborate, concentric circles around an inverted cross shape. I snapped a photo, and the camera glitched, the screen flickering. Then the battery died, even though I charged it that morning. Frowning, I swapped batteries. The new one also drained instantly, the camera shutting off. A chill crawled up my arms. That's when April called us over. She'd found a sealed box wedged behind one of the skeletons, locked tight with a rusted latch. After some delicate prying, we opened it. Inside lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, written in an old colonial script. Flipping through, we found references to La Société du Sang, or the Society of Blood, a secret group operating in Savannah's early days, practicing strange rites for power or protection. The final entries described a ritual to bind a monstrous entity beneath the earth, using live victims as the anchor. I swallowed hard. The last page read, in rough translation, "We have chained the devourer with blood and faith. Should the seal be broken, no mortal can contain the hunger once more." We all shared an uneasy look. April tried to dismiss it as overblown superstition, but the tension was palpable. Especially once we realized that we'd effectively broken the seal by opening the crypt. That afternoon, the caretaker, Mr. Higgs, wandered by. He was an old Savannah native, rumored to know more local lore than anyone. Seeing our equipment, he shook his head. "You folks messing with old bones down there?" he asked, a note of warning in his tone. April mentioned our discovery, and his face paled. "I heard rumors about a cursed tomb," he mumbled. "Bodies left chained, some wicked business from long ago. Y'all be careful. Savannah's got spirits enough without stirring up old devils." That night, the nightmares came for me, too. I dreamed of the crypt. Except it wasn't a dusty ruin, it was alive with flickering candles and hooded figures chanting in an unknown language. I walked among them, heart-pounding, as they turned to face me with empty black sockets where eyes should be. The altar in the center dripped fresh blood, and I realized it was my own. I jolted awake drenched in sweat, convinced someone stood at the foot of my bunk. My eyes adjusted to the dim room, revealing only shadows. But I felt watched, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Within days, several others reported similar nightmares. Kevin claimed he woke with scratch marks on his arms, as if the dream figures had left real wounds. Marie mentioned footsteps pacing outside her window at night. Dr. Emery heard disembodied sobbing in his motel bathroom. We tried to laugh it off, attributing it to stress or the power of suggestion. But each evening, the phenomena escalated. Doors slammed on their own. Phones rang with no one on the line. Faint knocking at midnight. And always, that oppressive sense we'd awakened something best left sleeping. The worst came on the morning of day 7, when we found Manny, the youngest grad student, curled up behind a tool crate, pale and trembling. He insisted a figure stood at his bedside all night, whispering in a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. Manny had lost consciousness, and now he refused to re-enter the crypt. April gave him a day off, but we all knew fear was tightening its grip on the group. On day 8, tragedy struck. Dr. Emery, who'd been cataloging artifacts in a side chamber, failed to appear for our midday check-in. We assumed he'd just lost track of time, but hours passed. We searched the tunnels, calling his name. Finally, we found him in the newly uncovered passage, lying face down in the dirt. At first, we thought he'd had a heart attack or stroke. But when we turned him over, we saw terror frozen on his face. His lips were twisted in a silent scream. Tiny welts covered his arms and chest, like he'd been clawed by a dozen small hands. The official coroner's statement would later read sudden cardiac arrest, but none of us believed it. April was distraught, tears glistening in her eyes. She wanted to suspend work, contact the city, block off the site. But we'd come so far. The research was monumental, and part of me, a foolish, driven part, urged her to push on. We rationalized that Dr. Emery might have had an underlying condition. We tried to ignore that small voice whispering the journal's warning, should the seal be broken, no mortal can contain the hunger. After Emery's death, the nighttime disturbances worsened. Marie woke screaming at 3 a.m., convinced someone pinned her to the bed. Manny insisted he saw a skull-like face peering through his window. Kevin found muddy footprints leading from his motel door to his bedside, then back out again. Every hour, someone's phone rang with static or faint laughter. I, too, felt it. The sense of being stalked, even in broad daylight. My reflection in mirrors seemed off, as if my eyes belonged to someone else. Shadows in my peripheral vision darted away when I turned. I began losing track of time. The knocks on my door became nightly, always around 2 a.m., always the same soft tap 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 followed by silence. April tried to keep morale up, but her face grew haggard, eyes ringed with dark circles. She confided in me that she dreamt of those shackled skeletons standing up and wandering the tunnels, calling her name. She didn't share that with the rest of the team, wanting to appear strong. But the exhaustion was clear. On day 10, we lost Manny. It happened during the lunch break. He was in the crypt alone, trying to gather last-minute data so he could catch an early flight home. He'd had enough. We heard a scream echo through the passage, then frantic scuffling. By the time we got to him, Manny was at the bottom of the stone steps, neck twisted at a grotesque angle. No one could explain how he fell so violently. The steps weren't that steep. Even the paramedics shook their heads. Another accidental death, they said. But I saw the look on Kevin's face, utter terror. He glimpsed a shadowy figure retreating into the crypt as we arrived. I believed him. That night, April declared the dig officially closed. She promised we'd turn everything over to the city and the Historical Society. But first, we had to finish documenting the altar chamber for the final report. A smaller crew, a final day. Then we'd seal the place for good. We should have walked away. But we didn't. The next morning, only 4 of us mustered the courage to re-enter, me, April, Kevin, and Marie. We descended into the crypt one last time, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The stench of decay and dampness was stronger now, like the place itself was rotting from within. As we stepped into the altar chamber, the oppressive atmosphere felt almost tangible. Our flashlights wavered, beams cutting through swirling dust. Those skeletons, still chained to the walls, seemed to watch us with hollow eyes. The splayed remains on the altar, a fresh addition we'd missed earlier, made Marie gasp. It looked like a small animal, half decayed. Kevin shuddered. Let's get this done and get out. We photographed the walls, took measurements, tried to ignore the strangled sense of dread. That's when we noticed a new symbol scratched into the stone near the altar, an inverted cross with swirling lines around it, identical to the hidden plaster image I'd found days ago. Except this was fresh, the edges crisp, like it had been etched recently with sharp metal. No one on our team had done this. A muffled knock echoed from somewhere behind the altar. We froze. Another knock, closer. Then a sudden, violent scraping noise, as if something heavy dragged across the stone floor. Marie let out a whimper, backing away. Kevin shone his flashlight at the far corner, and we glimpsed a shifting shape. It looked human but gaunt, with elongated limbs and vacant eyes that gleamed in the dark. My blood turned to ice. In a heartbeat, it lurched toward us, arms outstretched. We screamed, fumbling for the exit. The figure flickered in our lights, like a black silhouette cast over flickering film. Kevin tried to rush past it, but it caught him by the arm. He shrieked, agony twisting his face as the thing's grip left black welts. Run! April yelled, grabbing Marie. I stammered a plea for Kevin, but the shadowy figure pinned him, pressing him against the wall near the shackled skeletons. Kevin's screams echoed, rising to a crescendo that curdled my soul. I had no weapon, no plan. April pulled me back, tears streaming down her cheeks. We stumbled up the stone steps, hearing Kevin's final wail cut off abruptly. The entire crypt seemed to groan, the ceiling shaking dust into our eyes. Marie sobbed uncontrollably, half carrying herself up the corridor. Behind us, a scraping pursuit. My flashlight flickered, revealing glimpses of something crawling along the floor, multi-limbed or multi-shadowed, I couldn't tell. We burst into the main tunnel, hearts pounding, ignoring any attempt at caution. Up the ladder, through the pit, out into the cemetery's overcast daylight. We didn't stop until we reached the caretaker's office, babbling incoherently about what happened. April called the police. By the time they arrived, the pit was silent. The crypt lay still. No sign of Kevin. Over the following weeks, investigators found no creature in the crypt. They recovered Kevin's battered body near the altar, with injuries too gruesome to describe. Officially, it was labeled a mauling by an unknown animal or freak accident. Manny's fall, Emery's heart failure, just a string of bad luck. Savannah's press circled the story for a while, sensationalizing the cursed tomb, then moved on. April resigned her position at the university. She vanished from public life, rumored to be seeing a psychiatrist. Marie moved back to her hometown in Maine, refusing to talk about it. Me, I wrote a scathing letter to the Historical Society urging them to seal that crypt permanently. No reply. The nightmares persisted. Even after I returned home, I couldn't rid myself of the sense that something clung to me from that crypt, like a black mold, creeping into my dreams, whispering in a language older than English. Every night, I hear that gentle knock at my door, always around 2 a.m., the same tap tap tap. Sometimes I muster the nerve to fling it open, only to find emptiness. Other nights, I lie there, paralyzed, expecting to see a gaunt silhouette fade into the hallway. I've lost touch with nearly everyone who was on that dig. Rumor says one of the grad students took her own life. Another was hospitalized for a breakdown. At times, I want to reach out, to see if they feel the same presence watching from the corners, if they hear the same invisible footsteps. But fear stops me. Because if we talk about it, maybe we'll give it more power. I'm finishing this account in the small hours of the morning, with the lamp on and every door locked. Yet I know locks are meaningless. The entity or curse or spirit, whatever it is, doesn't need conventional entrances. It's in the gloom, the silence, the shadows beneath my eyelids when I blink. Savannah is a beautiful city, steeped in history. But it has a darker underbelly, a place where unspeakable acts once took root. Beneath Colonial Park Cemetery, a vile chapter from the 18th century lingers, feeding on fear and transgression. We peeled back that coffin lid, quite literally, and unleashed something best left forgotten. Some nights, I wake to find tiny footprints of dust near my bed, or streaks of black slime on the windowsill. My phone rings with no one on the other end, just heavy breathing that cuts off with a faint chuckle. My old camera sometimes powers up on its own, snapping pictures of empty rooms. Yet in those photos, I see flickers of movement, shapes that might be half-formed limbs, or a grin of teeth in the corner. If you find yourself in Savannah, maybe taking a ghost tour, or sipping sweet tea under the Spanish moss, remember, ghosts here aren't just quaint stories. Colonial Park Cemetery's tombstones already speak of plagues and duels and heartbreak. Now there's a deeper horror sealed below, something we disturbed and never properly contained. Do not let curiosity drag you into that crypt. Don't listen to the rumors of hidden catacombs or 18th century rituals. There are shadows in Savannah that go far beyond the playful legends. And if you hear faint knocks at your door in the dead of night, or wake to see a silhouette at the foot of your bed, pray it's just your imagination. Because otherwise, you might find yourself bound in nightmares, shackled to an altar you can't escape. I tell you this as a final plea: some secrets, some tombs, are better left sealed. The catacombs beneath Savannah's Colonial Park Cemetery were sealed for a reason written in bone and blood centuries ago. We learned that reason far too late, and the cost was more than we could bear. So heed my warning, dear reader. If you ever feel compelled to peel back the layers of old Savannah, do so gently. Respect the dead. Because in the crypt of the damned, they are anything but silent. And once you awaken them, they'll never let you go. Story number 3. Song of the Manchac Swamp. I've seen my share of backwoods nightmares and spooky legends. Growing up in rural Mississippi, I heard all the stories about haunted hollows, flickering lights in the forest, witches hiding in abandoned shacks. But none of that prepared me for what I encountered in the Manchac Swamp of Louisiana. I'd heard rumors, sure, tales of a cursed swamp, a long-dead voodoo practitioner who'd cast a spell on the area, a devastating storm that swallowed entire towns. I'd read about the missing expedition in 1995, how they vanished without a trace, only for their boat to be found years later, ripped apart as if by giant claws. Still, curiosity got the better of me. Call it my fatal flaw. My name's Trevor LaRue, and I'm an amateur folklorist, meaning I chase ghost stories and dusty urban legends all across the South. When a buddy told me about the cursed Manchac Swamp, my ears perked right up. I packed my camera, a notebook, a tent, and a couple weeks' worth of supplies. I had no illusions this would be a pleasant trip, but I never guessed it would become my personal descent into a waking nightmare. I arrived at the edge of the Manchac Swamp on a muggy August afternoon. The humidity slapped me in the face the moment I stepped out of my truck. Thick cypress trees loomed overhead, draped with Spanish moss that hung like tattered curtains. The air smelled of brackish water and rotting vegetation, a pungent sweetness that clung to my throat. There wasn't much of a town near Manchac. Just a few battered houses, a gas station that looked older than me, and a marina with peeling paint. An old man with skin like dried leather sat rocking on the marina's porch. He glanced at my gear and muttered something in French-inflected English, something about me tempting fate. I guess he knew why I was there. He stared at me with watery eyes. "You sure you want to go out in them waters, boy?" he asked, voice raspy. "That swamp's got a hunger." I forced a grin, though my stomach nodded. "Just research," I said. "I'll be careful." He huffed. "Lot of folks said that before." Then he slipped back into silence, letting his rocker squeak ominously. I rented a small flat-bottomed boat with an outboard motor from the marina. The only other occupant of the water that day was a weather-beaten fishing boat trolling near the channel. Even they left by sunset. I headed out, following the twisting bayou deeper into the swamp. The water was dark, tinted brown by tannins. Cypress knees jutted up like skeletal fingers. The sky above was a bruised purple, threatening rain. Before I even found a place to make camp, I heard them, faint, drifting voices. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe some radio static echoing across the water. But then, on the quiet hush of the bayou, I swear I caught the edges of a lullaby, soft, melodic, eerie as hell. My skin prickled. I turned off the motor, listened hard. Silence. Then a splash somewhere behind me. An alligator, maybe. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Nothing but nerves. I started the motor again and cruised until I found a small patch of higher ground to set up my tent. By then, dusk had fallen, and the swamp came alive with the buzzing of insects and the croak of frogs. Fireflies blinked among the moss-draped branches. If I hadn't felt so uneasy, I might have found it beautiful. After pitching my tent, I built a small fire in a circle of stones, hoping the smoke would keep the mosquitoes at bay. I sat on a camp stool, scribbling notes about the local legends I'd researched, the early 20th century voodoo priest, or priestess, depending on the version, who cursed the town of Frenier, claiming that upon her death, a great storm would drown them all. The 1915 hurricane that wiped out entire communities. The rumor that hundreds of restless spirits now wander the swamp, crying for release. I was about to pack it in when I heard that melody again. This time, it was unmistakable, a lilting tune, almost like a lullaby. My spine tingled. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded heartbreakingly sad, interspersed with low moans. I strained to pinpoint the direction, but the sound seemed to come from all around, echoing off the cypress trunks. Mustering my courage, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured a few yards from camp, careful not to lose sight of the fire's glow. The water lapped quietly at the marshy bank. Frogs croaked. The lullaby faded, replaced by the whisper of wind in the trees. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, my pulse hammered, and I retreated to my camp, nerves on edge. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. My dreams were full of half-seen shapes gliding between the cypress, beckoning me with gestures I couldn't resist. I woke to a sticky sunrise, the sky ablaze with pink and orange streaks. The swamp looked almost serene in the early light. I decided to spend the day exploring deeper, searching for any remnants of the rumored lost settlement or signs of old cemeteries. If the missing 1995 expedition left behind wreckage, maybe I'd spot something. Paddling through narrow channels, I navigated around thick mats of aquatic plants. Occasionally, I'd hear splashes, probably alligators or large fish. I kept an eye out for snapping turtles and water moccasins, too. In one clearing, I spotted the skeleton of an old shack perched on half-sunken pilings, its roof collapsed into the water. I docked, carefully walking the creaky boards. A broken sign out front read Melinda's. Perhaps a tiny store or cafe from decades ago. Inside, the floor was rotted, the smell of mildew thick. Yet I found an old photograph lying face down in the muck. Brushing off slime, I saw 4 figures, 3 men, 1 woman, smiling awkwardly with fishing poles in hand. Maybe it was from before the hurricane, or maybe after. No date. No names. A sense of loss weighed on me. So many lives uprooted, drowned, or cursed. The hush of the swamp pressed in, as if it, too, mourned something. But as I turned to go, I glimpsed a smear of dark mud on the wall that looked eerily like a claw mark. Long, thin grooves etched in pairs of 4. It made me think of the boat from '95, those unexplained scratch marks. My gut churned with unease. I spent most of the day weaving through cypress groves. At times, the channels twisted so much I wasn't sure I could find my way back. Twice, I spotted a figure drifting in a small pirogue, far off. Each time, when I tried to wave, they vanished behind mossy trees. I didn't see their face, just the shape of a person, silent, paddling away. Something about it gave me a chill. Why avoid me? By late afternoon, thunderheads built on the horizon. I decided to head back to camp before the rain hit. As I motored through a wider expanse of water, the lullaby rose again, faint as breath. I froze, scanning the horizon, no sign of another boat, no voices. Just that haunting tune carried on the wind. A sudden gust made ripples dance across the bayou. Then the singing died away. That night, a full-blown thunderstorm shook the swamp. Lightning illuminated twisted tree limbs, thunder rolling endlessly. I huddled in my tent, rain hammering the canvas. Water soaked through the edges, pooling on the tarp underneath. Every flash of lightning cast gnarled shadows across my walls, like spindly claws. Somewhere around midnight, in a lull between thunderclaps, I heard it, a scream. It sounded not too far away, a raw, desperate cry that raised every hair on my body. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and peered out into the sheets of rain. Darkness pressed in, cut by strobing flashes. The cypress trunks looked like silent sentinels, unimpressed by mortal fear. Then came the scream again, followed by a ragged, wet sobbing. "Hello?" I shouted over the downpour. No answer. The sobbing seemed to fade. Heart-pounding, I stepped into the rain, my boots sinking in mud. Lightning flared, revealing the boat listing at the bank, bobbing with each wave. Another flash, and I thought I saw a figure lurching among the trees. Then blackness. Every rational part of me said to stay put, wait out the storm, keep safe. But something else, call it duty or compassion, drove me forward. If someone was injured or lost, I couldn't ignore it. Holding my flashlight high, I followed the sound of sobbing deeper into the swamp. Mud sucked at my boots. Rain lashed my face. The lullaby rose in my mind, unbidden. I kept expecting to see a body or footprints, but the only movement was the rattling of wind-torn branches. Suddenly, the sobbing cut off. Silence, except for the storm. I tried to call again, but thunder swallowed my voice. A fierce gust nearly knocked me down, and I realized how dangerously easy it would be to get lost. Reluctantly, I turned back. My flashlight flickered, a battery dying too soon. In the dying beams, I glimpsed something, a shape behind a cypress trunk, tall, humanoid, peering at me from behind dripping moss. Eyes that glowed pale in the storm's darkness. I froze, breath-catching. Lightning crashed, and in that brief flash, the shape was gone. The swamp yawned around me. I stumbled back to my tent, soaked and shaking. For hours, I lay awake, listening to the storm's fury and wondering what I'd seen. Was it a trick of the light? The reflection of lightning on water? Or something else? The next morning, the storm clouds cleared, leaving the swamp steaming in the morning sun. My nerve was wearing thin. I considered leaving, but a stubborn part of me insisted I stay. There was more to discover, something that might explain the strange singing and the apparitions. I set out in my boat again, heading upriver. The water was murky from the storm, debris floating here and there. After an hour, I came upon a cluster of half-submerged tombstones, evidence of an old cemetery drowned by the 1915 hurricane, perhaps. The stones jutted at odd angles, their inscriptions worn by time. It was a sobering sight, names lost, final resting places swallowed by the swamp. I used a pole to push aside some floating logs and maneuver closer. One tombstone read Sophie Devereaux, 1888 to 1915. Another, Pauline Larac, the dates too eroded to read. The last I could discern was Anselm Durand, with a date of death precisely matching the great storm. The water near the tombstones felt colder, unnaturally so. A breeze skidded across my skin, though the day was warm. My gaze fell on something snagged on a tombstone, a scrap of cloth, bright blue, too modern to belong to a century-old victim. I fished it out with my paddle. Could it be from the missing expedition? Then the lullaby returned, drifting over the water with an almost hypnotic calm. I felt a peculiar heaviness behind my eyes, like I was about to drift asleep standing upright. The tune wrapped around me, pulling me toward the tombstones. For a terrifying instant, I pictured myself stepping over the side of the boat, wading into the black water, letting it claim me. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging. I forced myself to back away, start the motor, and gun it out of there. The singing pursued me, fading only when I reached the main channel. That evening, I rummaged through my gear, rechecking notes when I found a small battered notebook stuck in the corner of my pack. This wasn't mine, it was old, water-stained, with the initials EB scrawled on the cover. My heart skipped a beat. I'd never seen it before. Had I picked it up by accident somewhere? Flipping it open, I found a series of entries dated 1995. The handwriting was frantic. June 3rd, 1995, we've come searching for the lost cemetery. Max swears he saw lights dancing in the swamp at night. The singing is real, Jeannie recorded it on tape. We keep hearing cries at odd hours. June 6th, 1995, Wade disappeared at dawn. Went to relieve himself, never came back. We heard screaming, followed by a splash. Jeannie thinks it's the spirits from the hurricane. I'm not sure. June 9th, 1995, the boat is gone, found only scraps with deep claw marks. This is impossible. No gator does that. The singing grows louder each night. Jeannie prays constantly. Mac went out with a lantern but returned babbling about shadows and eyes in the water. June 10th, 1995, we are doomed. The lullaby leads us deeper in. We see shapes prowling between the cypress. Something is calling our names. I can't sleep. I can't. The last page was a watery blur. The EB might have stood for Edward or Emma, I didn't know. But reading this journal made my blood run cold. This was from the missing expedition. They heard the same singing, saw the same shapes. And they never came back. I spent that night wide awake by my campfire, the journal clutched in my sweaty hands. The forest rustled with night creatures. I half expected to hear that lullaby at any moment. Around midnight, it came, soft, weaving through the cypress. My mouth went dry. I sat stock still, listening. Then came footsteps, sloshing in the shallow water. I turned off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight. A silhouette emerged from behind a cypress trunk, creeping toward my camp. It was a woman, or so it seemed at first. She wore a tattered dress, her hair dripping with swamp water, face obscured by shadow. My heart pounded. How could anyone wander in here at this hour? I tried to speak, but my voice stuck in my throat. She lifted her head, and moonlight revealed her face, a gaunt visage, skin pale as bone, eyes hollow. Her lips parted, and the lullaby spilled out, impossibly loud yet still a whisper. My mind reeled. She raised one arm toward me, the hand shriveled, flesh like rotting cloth. Fear paralyzed me. She took a step closer. Suddenly, another shape appeared behind her. Then another. Figures emerging from the shadows, each with that same vacant stare. The odor of dank moss and decaying flesh drifted on the air. My instincts roared, run. Now. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight and backpack, stumbling toward the boat. The figures advanced slowly, their bare feet slapping against the muddy ground. The lullaby swelled, a chorus of the dead. I sprinted, hard hammering, pushing through the water to my boat. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the outboard's pull cord. The engine coughed to life, and I reversed, shining my flashlight on the shore. The group of apparitions stood at the water's edge, unmoving, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly. One figure raised a withered hand as if beckoning me back. My chest seized with dread. I gunned the engine, fleeing into the darkness. The singing followed, fading only after I turned a bend in the channel. A hush fell over the swamp, broken by my ragged breathing. Adrenaline spiked my senses, every sound a potential threat. I didn't stop until the eastern sky began to lighten with dawn, and I found a patch of shore to collapse on. I woke to the sun high overhead, stifling heat pressing down. My mind buzzed with the memory of those specters. I had to get out, find the main river, and return to the marina. No more exploring. This cursed swamp could keep its secrets. But the channel seemed different now. Every twist and turn led me deeper into a maze of identical cypress. My compass spun erratically. The lullaby teased my ears whenever I paused. Twice, I circled back to the same half-submerged log. Panic nibbled at me. I was lost, just like the 1995 expedition. The day stretched on, sun beating mercilessly. My water supply ran low. The boat engine sputtered as if choking on mud. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered again. I followed what I thought was an outbound channel, only to emerge in a wide lagoon I'd never seen before. The water was still, mirror-like. In the center rose a small island of cypress knees and twisted roots. Straining my eyes, I spotted what looked like a mound of debris, a battered wooden hull, bleached by the sun. The missing expedition's boat? I approached cautiously, the hush of the lagoon unsettling. The boat was half sunk, splintered, with vicious claw-like marks etched into the wood. In the hull, I found scraps of gear, rusted cans, a tangle of rope. The stench of rot lingered, though the remains must be decades old. My heart pounded, recalling the journal entries. Lightning crackled overhead, the storm building again. I heard a whisper, a human voice. I whipped around. Nothing but the cypress. Then a shrill cry cut through the air, piercing, like the scream I'd heard that stormy night. My blood turned to ice. Footsteps squelched behind me. I spun to see 3 figures emerging from the swamp. Their faces mirrored those I'd seen the night before, pale, hollow-eyed, drenched in water. One man wore a rotted life vest marked with EB. My stomach lurched. Was he the journal's author? They advanced with unnatural grace, arms outstretched, the lullaby thrumming around us. A faint, watery chanting enveloped my mind. I staggered back, tripping over a root, my flashlight clattering away. Rain started to fall in thick drops. I scrambled to my feet, but they closed in swiftly, cornering me against the half-sunken boat. Shaking, I brandished my small hunting knife. "Stay away," I croaked, though I doubted steel would harm them. One figure let out a low moan, as though in pain. Another reached for me with a trembling hand. Their eyes were anguished, brimming with tears, or swamp water. The lullaby's pitch rose, rattling my skull. In a burst of survival instinct, I lunged, slashing the air between us. The blade met resistance, a hiss of black fluid spattering across the hull. The figure recoiled, a grotesque shriek echoing through the trees. Lightning illuminated the scene, revealing sallow faces contorted in rage. The others lunged at me. I ducked and sprinted for my boat, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the thunder. Slamming the motor into gear, I sped away, not caring about the direction. Behind me, shrieks and howls cut through the rain, the lullaby warping into an anguished wail. Branches whipped at me as I navigated through the narrow channel, pushing the engine to its limit. Another flash of lightning illuminated dozens of silhouettes lining the banks, arms raised, mouths open in silent cries. By some miracle, I found a wide channel leading back toward civilization. The storm raged, but I followed a faint glow in the distance, maybe lights from the highway. My boat coughed, nearly stalled, but I coaxed it on. The singing faded behind me, replaced by the roar of rain and thunder. Eventually, I saw the dull orange glow of a street lamp near the marina. Relief flooded me. I docked sloppily, tying off in a daze. Rain-soaked, trembling, I stumbled into the marina's covered porch, where the old man still sat in his rocker. He eyed me with a mix of pity and resignation. Without a word, he fetched me a blanket and a mug of hot coffee from somewhere. I crumpled onto a bench, panting. "Did you see him?" he finally asked, voice low. I managed a nod. "What are they?" I stammered. Ghosts? The drowned souls? He shrugged, eyes clouded. Cursed. Bound to the swamp by that old voodoo spell. They can't rest. They lure people in with that singing. I swallowed, remembering the lullaby. I barely got out. He sighed, rocking slowly. Count yourself lucky, boy. Many don't. I left Manchac Swamp at dawn. Never bothered to retrieve my campsite, never looked back. My notebooks and camera were half ruined by rain, but I kept the 1995 journal. Part of me wanted to share the story, warn others. But I realized it might just lure more fools like me. Still, I can't bury the truth. The Manchac Swamp is a place of restless spirits, locked in an eternal lament, beckoning the living to join them. Now, weeks later, I'm haunted by nightmares. In them, I drift through the cypress groves, hearing that lullaby. I see hollow-eyed figures reaching for me, longing for release. Sometimes, I hear a knock on my door late at night, soft, rhythmic, like the cypress knees tapping my conscience. I lie awake, the melody echoing in my mind. I fear that some dark piece of the swamp followed me home. I share this account not to sensationalize death or curses, but to issue a warning. If you ever find yourself near Manchac Swamp, heed the local stories. Don't dismiss them as folklore. Keep your distance from those drowned graveyards, from the lonely channels where no boat should ever go. Because once you hear that lullaby calling your name, it's all too easy to lose yourself in the cypress shadows, never to return. They say the dead roam freely in those waters, tied by a vow sealed in blood and storm. They sing to the living, inviting us to join their eternal vigil. I'll hear that singing in my nightmares until the end of my days. And I know, deep down, the swamp is still waiting, hungry for the next soul who can't resist the call of its dark lullaby.